In the early hours of the morning of the 28th of November 2021 in the city of Stirling, Christopher McGowan called 999 desperately asking for help after his girlfriend Claire had fallen down the stairs. Yet when the paramedics arrived at her flat, they found holes punched in the walls, blood on the ceiling, and knew something else was at play. Claire's parents and her closest friends had all warned Claire that her latest relationship was never going to end well. But nobody ever could have predicted this. This is the murder of Claire Inglis. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I saw this in the press when this killing occurred and I needed to follow it. It just felt so brutal that somebody could meet an individual, believe that they could make that individual better, and within a matter of weeks find themselves dead. If you're new to my channel, my name is Emma Kenny. I release my content on a Wednesday and a Sunday, so if you like crime and consistency and also well-researched deep dives, then this is definitely the channel for you. If you haven't subscribed yet, then why don't you take a moment to do that? Let me take you a second, get your notifications on, and then you will never miss one of my episodes. Thanks to everybody coming back repeatedly. You make a difference to my world, and I appreciate you massively. So let's talk about Claire Inglis. She was born in 1993. She was born in Stirling, which is Scotland's smallest city. And she was very small, so to speak. She was petite in stature. She stood at 5'2". And obviously, as a girl, that's a lovely petite height. But I want you to think about how that also can play in to you not necessarily being physically that dominating. When you're petite, it makes it more easy for people to overpower you. And clearly, when we're talking about Claire, this is something that's going to play into what happens in this case. Now, before Claire meets Christopher McGowan, her life was literally full of positive plans for the future. She graduated, she was a childminder, she had a career that she'd always dreamt of. She was an avid babysitter for friends and family when she was growing up. This was just really vocational for her. And I think that anybody who goes into a role of childcare, firstly, they have to have endless patience. They have to be an individual who can cope with quite stressful situations. I have children, they're amazing. But the truth is that at times even your own kids can act in a way that's distressing because they're struggling, they're crying, they're upset, they're stressed, and so on and so forth. Imagine doing that with numerous children and having the patience to do that in a balanced and kind, compassionate manner. So that speaks volumes about who she is as a human being. And she's really committed to this. This isn't a flash in the pan desire where she's just going to test it out and try it out. She genuinely has this connection to children and she's passionate about that particular area of her life. And her parents both recall that she was a really happy-go-lucky, kind-hearted girl. She was always dancing. They have really happy memories of family holiday to Disneyland Paris, and she was somebody that could always be found singing and dancing. They said that she had a shy streak, but when she was with them, that just dissipated. And she was somebody who was really free in their company. It seems like as a young person growing up, to all intents and purposes, Claire had the foundation, the family support, the vocational opportunities, and the hope of a really promising future, along with being a thoroughly devoted parent. And again, when somebody is that devoted to their child, it speaks volumes about their nature. She's somebody who should have found a partner who loved her, who raised her up, who adored her, and who made her feel like the special person that everyone else knew that she was. And her mother also said that she was a human being who just made you smile. She said that even though she's a mother, and therefore there may be a level of bias towards her daughter, the truth was she was just one of those people that always had a smile on her face and always had the power to make you smile. So a truly lovely human being. Now, unfortunately, life is going to change dramatically for Claire because She begins a relationship with a guy called Christopher McGowan. Now, Christopher McGowan was 28, as she was at the time of their meeting. He was a painter and decorator, but if only that were all he was, because understandably, a painter and a decorator is somebody who can bring in a decent wage and look after your DIY and hopefully give you a suited partner. But that's not who Christopher McGowan is at all. Fiona, Claire's mum, actually said that when she kind of had her first conversation about McGowan, it was because he'd shouted at her in the street, and it hadn't happened too long before they actually got involved in a relationship. And she'd said to her mum that she was really glad to get away from him as, quote, he's a bad one. Now, there you go. Claire's intuition speaking volumes. Even though she's had this interaction with him, she's immediately felt like there's something concerning about his behaviour. And it's worth noting that she'd actually dated one of his cousins, so she would have a connection with him, and that would be no doubt why he'd had that kind of interaction with her in the street. But nonetheless, she knows immediately he probably isn't the kind of person that you want to be around. And her mum said that she absolutely hated him, so she couldn't understand, as her mother, how in a fortnight from that interaction, it went from hating him to being in a relationship with him. She said, we just couldn't get our heads around it. I still can't get my head around it, she says on reflection. So when Claire starts this relationship with McGowan, she obviously has to confide in her mother, because you're going to tell your parent that you've found a new partner. So she calls her mum and she says, Mum, you're going to be really, really upset. But even though her mum was upset because she feels like this guy is not a good person to be around, at that moment during that phone call, she had no idea of just how terrible and treacherous the road would be for Claire. And actually, she's really annoyed with Claire for deciding to date this guy. She doesn't know a lot about him, but she knew his name and she knew that he was bad news. She considered him to be a street thug. She considered him to be far from the role model that she and her husband would anticipate that Claire would ever get involved with. And remember, they're thinking about their grandchild as well. They've got a grandson in the picture. And sadly, that grandson of theirs had already lost his father. His dad had died in a road accident in 2017. So understandably, they want Claire to go out and meet somebody who can be a mentor, a step-parent, a role model, an individual that that little boy can look up to and feel a sense of pride within and have pride given through the eyes of that parent. But that's not who McGowan is. And if you could imagine the absolute polar opposite, well do, because then you'll find exactly who he is. There would be literally a picture of Christopher McGowan at that polar opposite description of the kind of person that they're looking for. Now, she goes ahead and announces, I suppose, to the world through Facebook in autumn 2021 that she's in a relationship with McGowan. And like I said, her family are not happy about this at all. He also had the name Kiki, which deeply disturbs me because honestly, it just, for me, makes me think about violence. Somebody who, you know, is handy with their feet. But this is just me reading into that nickname, but it would not surprise me. And by the end of this video, I think you'll agree that Kiki is likely an appropriate name for all the wrong reasons. So he was already a very familiar face to the police in Stirling because he has a pretty long rap sheet. So he was picked up for his first conviction when he was 14. 14. That was in 2009. It was for a breach of the peace. In total, however, he had 40 previous convictions. That's right, I said 40. 40 is 28. That's ridiculous. And what does it say to you immediately, psychologically, about this person? He does not accept consequences. He doesn't deal with boundaries as they're meant to be dealt with. He's somebody who is clearly not that consequential because he keeps repeating the pattern. And he's obviously somebody who doesn't care about authority, because you wouldn't continue to do things that get you into trouble if it bothered you. Either he's got no impulse control whatsoever, or he has a malevolent thread running through him, which means that he does not care when he is told what to do in the future, with consequences that can be dire if he fails to go ahead and follow that protocol. He's somebody who will just happily go about doing whatever he wishes to do. And they're not little crimes that we're talking about. So he's got convictions for violence, 3 counts of assault, robbery, dealing heroin. And when you think about dealing heroin, it's the worst of the worst, the lowest of the low. You are literally ruining people's lives. It's a very unhappy story when somebody becomes dependent to heroin. And if you're willing to put yourself in a position when you're the person who's actually giving it out to them, you have very few morals. And on top of that, in 2014, he was done for domestically aggravated breach of the peace. He was subject to 4 other bail orders. He'd been jailed for 21 months in April 2020. And the reason for that is he had literally threatened to, quote, do in a cop with a 6-inch blade. Now, if you are willing to threaten a police officer, because come on guys, they come down hard on people who threaten police officers or assault police officers. If you're a boy in blue or a girl in blue, you have an extra protection because clearly you are meant to stand for the law. So when somebody threatens you, you are literally threatening the law, and that's represented usually in the sentences that you receive. So Kiki, or McGowan, whichever way you want to think of him as, he was really well known by members of the local community. He was considered somebody that you should absolutely avoid. We all know those kind of people, don't we, growing up? I'm not saying that we're friends with them. I'm not saying that they're people who move in our direct network, but you just know who they are. They're absolute not right. So the kind of people that are volatile, they're the kind of people who offer conflict wherever they go. They're hostile beings. They're people who reputationally have a whole impact that precedes them. And he fits that paradigm perfectly. He's someone you should stay away from because you would end up potentially in trouble, either with him or at the hands of him. And Stacey Marshall, a friend of Claire's, she said that McGowan was actually, as far as she was concerned, very persuasive. So he was the kind of person that at the very beginning of a relationship, even though he has this reputation, even though people are very cautious of him, that he could turn on the charm. He was somebody that would be convincing in his role. He'd be kind. So love bombing, I suppose, is what we'd throw in here, isn't it? Where you meet somebody, and even though you hear about all the negatives regarding who they are as a human being, you kind of think to yourself, well, he's being so nice to me, or she's being so nice to me, and that makes you feel that potentially everyone else has got it wrong, or maybe they're different with you. And this is how love bombing works, and it's how coercive controllers really do begin to tighten the ropes of control over the person they're seeing. So he's doing that effectively. And equally, I do appreciate that relationships start off with people being nice to you. That's why you get involved in relationships. So to some degree, in every relationship, there's a level of love bombing. It's just that it's done for the right reasons, not because they are manipulative and are trying to entrap you with your emotional feelings towards them before doing horrible things to you. But you've got to look at past behavior. Past behavior is a predictor of future behavior. I know that people say that you can change, and maybe you can to some degree, but you can on the whole fail to transform very often. It's one of those realities. It's difficult to transform completely, and somebody like this would need to transform completely if he really is going to make a difference to her life in a positive way, or I guess to his own life in a positive way, because this guy has got a rap sheet that's very long. He's quite a violent human being, and I can tell you now, I'll go into it a little bit more in detail later on, he's also been a violent perpetrator in relationships before. So this does not bode well. But he's not going to be introducing himself to Claire like that. Bear in mind that what perpetrators will do, what domestic abusers will do, is they'll always have a reason. They'll have a sob story so long and so intense and so detailed that by the end of telling that story, the person that you're with will feel sorry for you. They'll see you as a victim. They'll understand why you've acted in ways that are wrong, because you'll have been treated terribly in your childhood, or people have bullied you horribly, and so on and so forth. You paint a picture of possibility that allows that person to go, well, it would be different if I came in and healed that person. It would be different if I loved that person deeply. It would be different if I treated that person with respect, and so on and so forth. That's what they're doing. They're fishing for that hook to be caught by you, so that you are then trapped by them in that whole emotional dialogue that they create, that is usually fabricated enormously to make them seem like a victim and to minimize the actions that they've carried out in the past. And he certainly is very adept at doing this. Now, Claire and McGowan's relationship, I would say, builds in intensity, as things do in those early stages, but they'd only been together a total of 8 weeks, which was, with respect, interrupted by a month's spell in HMP Low Moss, which is near Glasgow. So he'd gone to prison for a month during that period, and Claire had been dutiful and caring, and she'd been visiting him whilst he was in jail. And his most recent conviction, and obviously therefore what he was in prison for, was that he'd pleaded guilty to dangerous driving in a high-speed police chase, he'd resisted arrest, and he'd also breached his bail curfew. So he ain't following the rules. He's not somebody who cares. You can give him his sentences, you can give him his convictions, but he's not bothered. He's literally been in a high-speed chase with the police. There is a certain mentality that you see, particularly in young men who do this, and it's about the thrill. They don't feel fear in the way that they should. And if you think about psychopathic brains, they don't feel fear in the way that they should. They need something high octane to give them any sense of emotional gravity, to give them a more extreme feeling than they used to, because they don't have feelings in the way that you or I would. So that high octane activity is what he's doing to get his kicks. And that's deeply disturbing. Because if you don't understand fear properly, then you can do a lot of damage. And if you're not bothered about consequences, you can do a lot of damage. And if being banged up in prison doesn't adjust your behaviour, then you're only going down one road, and it's not going to be a positive one. But she's kind. She's going to support him. She's believing, without a doubt, that she can change him. This is the mistake that so many women and so many men make, because they are good people. And if you are a good person, you see the best in other people, and you can't. And in life, we're told to be kind. It's such a damaging suggestion in these situations, though, because you have to view others how they act within their world. You have to take those actions, what they're capable of doing, and then perceive them with that view, with those glasses, not the rose-coloured ones that you're wearing. But this is why people end up getting murdered by partners. It's why people get conned by partners, because they're always imagining them in the best light, as opposed to that actual cold light of reality. Now, it's from that prison that McGowan appeared via video link at Stirling Sheriff Court in September 2021. At this point, he tells the court that he's basically desperate to be released because his mother had recently died and he didn't want to attend her funeral in handcuffs. I'm just going to throw it out there. That would really annoy me. It obviously didn't where this sheriff and court is concerned, but if you're coming on by video link and being like, you know what, my mum's died, feel sorry for me, I'd like to get out and not be in handcuffs at the funeral, I'd be like, well, there's a really simple recipe to this. Don't keep committing offences like resisting arrest and driving in a high-speed chase with the police following you. Just follow that protocol, and for every other funeral, you'll be present without a tag or handcuffs. But it seemed to have some kind of impact. So he was granted bail after social workers said that he had a new girlfriend and that their relationship was positive. And the report also stated that he was motivated to stay out of trouble and to come off alcohol and Valium. Could you ever have imagined a less convincing report to actually take seriously? Can we just run through that a moment? And this is really important because we are talking about Claire Inglis being murdered horribly. And for all that Claire Inglis will have known about his past and the way that he's repackaged it and made her feel safe with him, she will also be looking at the way that the authorities act around him to make decisions based on their relationship. And if a social worker is writing a positive report to the court saying, off he goes, it's fine, he's going to get off the drugs and alcohol, he's got this nice girlfriend, it's reinforcing that picture that she will in her head have created. And it's essentially pushing her further down that belief system that maybe this relationship could work out because, hey, the authorities are ready to let him go. After all, he's made some loose promises. When you actually look at the bare bones of what's going on there, he said he had a new girlfriend. Well, first off, that means there's no history. So that can't indicate that something positive is happening because it's new. And of course, it's not going to be brought into that situation by him that it's not positive, because why would he want to introduce that to his social worker? He could be lying about it, full stop. Also, he says he's motivated to stay out of trouble and come off alcohol and Valium. Hey, why is he still on alcohol and Valium? Surely, if we're going to do something positive, get him off the alcohol and Valium. Maybe it would be better to keep him locked up until he can be placed on a rehabilitation program. Throwing it out there. This guy is not somebody new to offending. He has a rap sheet so long you would not run out of toilet paper for a considerable amount of time reading it. So it worries me deeply. And the very fact that they actually grant bail to Claire's flat. Yes, I did say that. So they see fit to send this violent man to a new girlfriend's flat and to grant bail there. So Claire is living at this time in a housing association flat on Coulton Hove Crescent, but she doesn't make the housing association aware that she's with McGowan because that will alter their tenancy. But bail have happily sent him there, not checked any of the due diligence and details. He shouldn't have been present. Fourth Housing Association most likely would not have let him stay there. And if there were any benefits involved, she would have had those affected. So when we think about the chain in causation that leads to these horrible losses, we look at all the variables that could have changed to deflect what plays out. And potentially that intervention could have prevented him being placed there with his bail conditions being set to that address. Now, all the while that this is happening, you have Claire's parents, Ian and Fiona, and they are really upset. They cannot believe how quickly this has moved on. And I empathise massively with Ian and Fiona, and believe me, this is not a judgment statement whatsoever on Claire. I know that we are dealing with a really high-level manipulative predator. It's as simple as that, and they are clever, and they get what they want. That's what they do. So I am not coming down hard on Claire for letting him move in, but for Ian and Fiona, they are doting grandparents, and I mean they really are doting grandparents. They're doting parents. So they're thinking not just about their gorgeous daughter, they're thinking about their grandson. They don't want this criminal near him. And they get so angry with her because they feel that she's letting herself down, and they certainly feel to some degree she's letting her son down. And that's completely out of character for somebody who has totally devoted herself to her child. And they want her to realise how upset they feel. So initially they actually cut off contact with her. And the reason for that is they're trying to create that choose us or him. Because obviously they have a lifetime of connection with her. And the hope with that tough love reaction is that she's going to pick them. But the issue is that when you have somebody who is very manipulative, when you have an individual who is just hardwired to some degree to be a coercive controller, then they can literally make it all but impossible for that person to retain relationships with the people that they love. Isolating them from their network is pivotal in ensuring that they have more power and control over their victim stroke partner. So her parents are doing the right thing as far as making her clearly see that they are not approving of this horrible relationship they think that she's got herself into with a man that they don't trust. But equally, that's playing into his hands because he wants her by herself. He doesn't want her to have any support. And that's doubly manipulative from his position. He's managing to orchestrate this to some degree because his reputation precedes him, and her parents are responding and reacting to that reputation. And her refusal to end the relationship with him means that now he's got her all to himself. Gemma, who's another friend of Claire's, she was really shocked when she heard about the relationship playing out. She said the two of them were just chalk and cheese. He was in and out of jail. He was horrible. He was always getting up to no good. He was just someone you would never think Claire would go to. And so many people will feel this way from the outside looking in, but you have to remember what a domestic perpetrator, what a coercive controller will do is they will play a game. They're quick with intensity. They convince the person that they're with that they love them. They create stories and manipulate situations to make them seem like a victim. And then they make that person reason with unreasonable to such a degree that that individual victim is confused constantly and scared. And so even though everything around her is screaming that she shouldn't be involved in this relationship, she will likely not be fully aware of what is playing out She will certainly have no control in how it's playing out. And as he ups the ante on the control, she'll become more and more afraid. It's just the most horrible situation. And it's why I constantly talk when I discuss cases like this about needing to get out as fast as possible, needing to do what I said moments ago, which is you cannot judge a human being by the way that you feel about them. You have to judge them by the actions that they show you. And in this case, Claire should be running as fast as she possibly can. But like I said, these predators, they're clever. And it's not long after he's moved in that there's an increase in controlling behaviour. Of course there is. This is what we see with coercive controllers and domestic abusers. So first of all, her parents start to suspect that McGowan is doing drugs again. So much for that I won't be taking Valium and drinking alcohol. And they think that he starts to financially exploit her. So she regularly starts getting in contact with them. And she'd rarely done this previously, asking for sums of money. It wasn't in her nature. But she ends up asking for £25 a few times a week. And then a week before Claire is sadly murdered, her grandma passes away. And her mum said that during this time, which is obviously very, very sad, they were a very close family, they all go over to the grandma's house because they want to provide comfort for her before she actually dies. And then they wish to pay their respects after they lose her. And her mum said it was really weird. Claire kept going off into different rooms and she was taking selfies, and she thought that was really strange, bearing in mind the occasion. It was a sad occasion. It's hardly the place and position that you'd be taking selfies. But in retrospect, it's very likely, her mum believes, that she was having to prove to McGowan exactly where she was. And this is textbook. This is what domestic abusers do. They want to make that person consistently feel that they have to evidence what they're doing, where they're going, who they're with. It's a method of incremental control. The more that you can get people to act in these manners, the more controlling you can become over them. It makes them more malleable. It makes them more susceptible. He's training her to do exactly what he is asking her to do. And that is breaking down her locus of control. It's making her more susceptible to further demands. There were also texts that were supposedly sent by Claire, but they had really bad spelling, and there were uses of emojis, and she never used them. And also her parents received texts that had supposedly been sent by Claire, and the problem with these texts is that they included bad spelling, they included emojis that she'd never use. And the thing about writing in text messages, it's a little bit like me. I always put a kiss at the end of whatever I write, usually to whoever I write. It's bizarre on reflection. I'm sure my bank manager probably doesn't really feel that I need to give him a kiss at the end of it, but it's just part and parcel of the way that I happen to text. Probably highly unprofessional, having said that out loud, but I do it. And that would mean that if somebody took over from me and was texting somebody else, they'd probably do things like punctuate correctly and not put the kiss on the end, and that isn't the way I write. I'm really bad at punctuation because I'm dyslexic, and I always personalise it with that kiss. Likewise, Claire will have a way of writing, and to her mum and dad, it doesn't feel like it's her writing them at all. And again, that is about him incrementally shifting the levels of control. He's going up the gears. The more that you can take the power away from the person that is your victim, the person in this case who's your partner, the more that you can make them flexible to accommodate anything else that you require. So taking power off her phone isn't just about wanting to check what's going on there. It's about letting her know that he is now the puppet master. And that's what coercive controllers do. Her parents do start to get quite exasperated because she's ringing up for money. She'd always previously budgeted very carefully, and they felt that the minute that they handed any money over, it was going to be handed to this controlling boyfriend who they know has got this long history of abusing drugs and abusing alcohol. And they are absolutely bob on. And this is another reason why families get really frustrated when they see a person that they love falling into a relationship that's so diabolically dark and dangerous, because they can see the immediate change in the person that they adore. And you want to bring them back into the light. And it's so quick that the clutches of the coercive controller grip that person that it's quite blindsiding to watch, because you will believe as an onlooker looking into that situation, that this individual has to be able to see just how awful this is. It's obvious to everybody from the outside because you're just seeing the scraps. You're seeing the person calling you and saying, can I have money? You're seeing the person saying, I can't stay, I've got to go back home. You're seeing the person changing the way that they look clothes-wise. You're seeing them struggling in a whole range of ways. But what you're not seeing is what happens behind the closed doors. Now, that can be intimidation and violence. It can also be passion. It can also be kindness, complimentary behaviour. It can also be, feel terribly sorry for me, my life's been awful, you're my saviour. All of these tactics are used by the coercive controller, and you're only seeing 5 to 10% of their behaviour, and it's the worst of, so it's obvious to you. But you have to understand that what's going on behind those closed doors that grips and clutches that person within it is far more complex, and it makes it far more challenging to get somebody out of those situations. Sadly, the intuition that Claire's parents have is absolutely spot on. So weeks after she's asking them for money and they're becoming exasperated because they feel that this has never been a part of her life. She's always done well financially. They find out that she owed thousands of pounds, and this was all for men's clothes. So McGowan had basically ensured that he'd been bought loads of catalogue clothes. So loads of credit had been taken out so that he could benefit. And even if it was Claire who was buying them for him, that would be because she was being controlled to do so. It's far more likely that actually he's just going ahead and buying what he wants and using her credit. But even if she was actively involved in that transaction and willingly agreeing to let him have those things, that would be because of fear and because she's been so coerced into this situation where she feels that she has to do whatever it is that will make him happy. Firstly, because there could be awful consequences otherwise, and secondly, because he's probably made her feel that he deserves it because he's had such an awful time and that she makes him feel special, and so on and so forth. This is the way that these people work. Also, they find out that he's pawned their grandson's PlayStation and also a watch which she'd been given for her 21st birthday, and that's the same year that she'd given birth to this gorgeous little boy that she doted on. So he is literally exploiting her now, and they're going to be angry because to mum and dad, their reality is, we've brought you up to know better than this. What on earth are you doing? You've seen a good relationship between me and your father. How can you not compute that what this man is doing to you is dreadful? He's stealing from you. He's stealing from your child. But again, that's from a very functional, rational perspective. And it also involves a level of compassion and feeling for the individual that you want to protect that leads to frustration as well. But for the person who is immersed in that relationship, it's a completely different story. The individual who's pawning your goods is telling you, it'll be okay, I'll do A, B, and C. I just need it today and then I'll sort it out next week. And if you're a compassionate, forgiving, loving person, you'll often buy in to that belief system. And also, Claire has something to prove. She probably doesn't want people to think that all this terrible stuff is happening because she genuinely believed that this relationship could work. So potentially, if she can just hang on, work harder, do more, trust in him, give him a second chance, he'll come good with it. And again, that story is as old as time in domestically abusive relationships. And it makes perfect sense that her family are getting annoyed because they have no idea just how exploited and how in danger she is. And of course, it often leads in these situations to parents removing support and giving you the tough love approach, but that unfortunately also plays into the hands of the perpetrator. And this is exactly what happens for Claire's mother the day before Claire is actually murdered. So she rings her mum repeatedly asking for £25 and her mum's had enough. So she activates the do not disturb mode on her phone so she and her husband could just enjoy spending some time with their grandson because he was staying over at their home that evening. And clearly she wanted to just devote herself to that and not have that annoyance where she knows that this is him getting to her through her daughter so that she can hand money over to him, and she's not willing to play a part in that. Also, bear in mind the fact that our own mum, Sheila Campbell, she just died the previous weekend. So they'd gone through all the exhaustion of planning her funeral, and Claire was actually meant to read a poem during that service. And she said in an interview, she'd been on at me all day to get £25. And I was like, no, what's it for? And then she went on to say, I'd never seen her stuck. She said it was for her son's boxing lessons. And I said, no, it's not. You're lying. You're not getting any more money from me. Then she said that she put the phone to engaged. And she also went on to talk about the fact that since her daughter's death, she's literally tortured herself because she realises having that do not disturb on the phone could have prevented Claire actually getting in contact with her when she needed her, and that's really haunted her. And again, this is something that McGowan has actually stolen from her mother. Aside from Claire herself, he's stolen her peace of mind. Imagine torturing yourself with the idea that potentially you could have helped your daughter, but your phone was off. I know that that doesn't play out in reality. Her mother did nothing wrong. It's completely understandable what she did and why her actions went that way. But she's going to beat herself up with that every single day. It's inevitable. And this is so powerful to remember, because we're not just talking about Claire as the victim here. We're talking about the ramifications for the victims who are left. And her parents and her son have become the biggest victims of this case. The following day, 5 a.m., she and her husband were told of an emergency at Claire's home. So this is when their worst nightmares begin to unravel. They leave their grandson in the care of a neighbour immediately and they rush to the flat. And it's at this point that the full extent of the horror begins to unfold. And Claire's mother was so utterly stunned and shocked by what had occurred. She became so distraught that she literally fainted. Now bear in mind, there has been a prelude to what Claire's mother and father arrived to that day. So on the 23rd of November 2021, this is 5 days before her death, McGowan receives a community payback order. Now, a community payback order, a CPO, it's a sentence that's served in the community rather than prison by a person who's convicted of a lower level or a lower tariff crime in court. And the whole aim of a community payback order, it's all designed to ensure that the people who commit the offences basically pay the dues to the communities that they've harmed. So often there'll be a requirement for them to carry out unpaid work of between 20 to 300 hours. And this is meant to benefit the community. And the second thing is it's going to reduce the risk that the person will reoffend because it's going to address any underlying problems. So this is done by imposing one or more of a further 8 provisional requirements. So they've got these opportunities to do things like place a curfew on the person who's offended. And that's exactly what they do with him. So they do this order, it includes a curfew and it requires him to stay in the flat between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. because arguably they will think that the offending rates are going to go higher, potentially if he goes out in the evening because he's got an issue with alcohol or drugs, and that could make it more possible for him to access these things. So he's meant to remain in her flat during that curfew. But as we know, McGowan isn't one for towing the line, is he? So on the 26th of November 2021, there's a neighbour who returns home and he actually hears McGowan storming out of the house, shouting to Claire, "Hurry up, you fat cow." This is exactly what these kind of abusers do. Bear in mind, Claire is this lovely looking girl, but if you want to really upset a female, we all know that being negative about the way they look is a really quick way to erode their self-worth and self-esteem. And that's what he wants to do. He wants to make her feel terrible about herself. And the fact that he's shouting to Claire where it's audible to other people, he's got no respect whatsoever. On the 27th of November, McGowan breaches his curfew. Of course he does. And he's actually out. He was with Claire. He's very drunk in Stirling City Centre. But he should have been indoors. Claire can go where she wants, do what she wants. She is free. She's not done anything wrong. She's not broken any rules. She's not an offender. But he is meant to be towing the line, and he isn't. Like I said, no acceptance of boundaries, no concern about authority. Then, when he's out and he's noted by people to be there, he starts shouting at her to go and buy alcohol. This is just before 10 p.m. on the 27th of November. So she dutifully does this because clearly the consequences and ramifications of her not doing it would be dire. So she goes into a local corner shop and she buys the items for him. And it's chilling really because her going into that shop is captured on CCTV, and they're literally the last moments that she'd ever be physically seen alive again. And this is so deeply upsetting, isn't it? That this man has exploited this young woman, has certainly eroded some of her self-worth by this point, has financially exploited her to a point where she's got issues with her own family member, and is now abusing her in a very public way and humiliating her in a very public way. And he demonstrates the malice in his temperament in those actions. So we now have this young woman who has got problems in her family, fractures that have arrived because of the dysfunction that he's created. She's clearly putting up with behaviour that is reprehensible by him, and she's been financially exploited to a point where she's in massive debt. Her life is spiralling, all because of this horrific human being who's come into her world and she's obviously tried to protect and help. So on the 28th of November, neighbours get woken up. It's 5 a.m. at this point. Christopher McGowan is banging on their doors, shouting, "Waken up, I think I've killed her." So he's literally ran to a neighbour's and is now acknowledging that he believes that he's killed her. He then shouts to neighbours, "Help, she's covered in blood, she's not breathing." Can you imagine how traumatising that is for those neighbours? It's blindsiding. This is early hours of the morning, and all of a sudden this man is banging on the doors, basically saying he's responsible for killing somebody and that this individual is either dead or mortally wounded. So two heroic male neighbours, they rush to Claire Inglis' house and they find her and they attempt CPR for 30 minutes. This is before the paramedics actually arrive. One neighbour said, quote, "She was so badly beaten, I couldn't tell where her face ended and her neck began." So you can visualise just how swollen and discoloured she would have been for them not to be able to calculate what her head and what her neck was, where her face was and where her neck began, because that shows how disfigured she would have been by the beating. They pronounced her dead at 5:41 a.m. There was literally nothing that they could do. Understandably, whilst he's present at the scene and as far as I'm concerned is bang to rights, the reality is that the investigators need to know exactly what played out. And what's really upsetting about this case is that her own mother, Fiona Inglis, didn't even know how her daughter was actually killed. She had to wait 2 years. So she had to wait until the trial date for her to understand exactly how her daughter had been lost. That in itself must have been torture. Claire's father actually went to the house after they'd taken Claire's body. The police had been there before, obviously, because they need to make sure that the scene was secured and they got the evidence that they needed. And it really upset Claire's dad. He said that she would never have left it like that. He actually wanted to tidy up because he wanted to preserve her memory. When he looked around, he said there was damage to the walls. As you stepped inside the house, it was immediately obvious that things had been damaged. He found blood on the blinds, on the ceiling in the living room. He found blood on the skirting boards on the walls. There were punched holes in the walls in the living room. There were punch marks on the fridge. Imagine walking into that scene and knowing that they were the last things that your child saw before her life was taken. His hypothesis after he saw the home was that Claire had faced physical abuse in pretty much every part of the house, whether that had been on the actual night that she was murdered or whether that had happened in the days leading up to her death. And what's even more chilling is that Fiona and Ian had said that just before her death, she'd told them that McGowan was actually being good to her, that he'd promised he'd change. This was just in the days before she is killed. And she told her mum, "You're just a drama queen, he's good to me, he's going to change." And her mum said, yeah, he did, into a murderer. In those weeks after Claire had been brutally slain, the only comfort that her mum felt was that Claire had been really joined at the hip with a gram, and that now she was dead, they would be together, but also that it was a saving grace that her grandma had died because she would never have been able to have coped with the fact that she'd lost Claire. And her mum said that when it came down to actually planning the funeral, she said, losing my mum was a total nightmare. You're burying your mum and thinking you've got another funeral coming up. It was horrendous. I've not got my mum to go to, but there was a reason for it, because my mum would never have accepted it. The only comfort they said in those weeks after Claire's death was that their grandson hadn't been present on the night of the murder, because they fully believed that McGowan would have taken his life. Claire's mum said, the only thing we're grateful for as well is that we know for a fact from the injuries that he gave Claire that our grandson, had he been there that night, would have gone as well. She went on to say he would have tried to protect Claire, and instead of just one coffin, there would have been a wee white coffin next to it. And I think that makes sense, because this guy is a high-level predator and nothing would have got in the way of him doing what he wanted to do to Claire. Her mum went on to say, this situation would be exactly the same. The big difference would be that I would have lost two of them. And that's not going to make up in any way, shape or form for Claire's death and Claire's murder, but I think she's correct. All her intuition has been correct. And I agree. This man would, without a shadow of a doubt, in a heartbeat, taken the life of that innocent child. We get to the trial. So this begins on the 28th of September 2023, and the trial lasted 7 days. Now, bear in mind, McGowan is a grotesque, reprehensible excuse of a human being that should never walk our streets again. Goes without saying. But wow. The mark of the man is demonstrated during the trial. So first of all, her parents, who, like I said, didn't really know exactly what had played out. They had to wait for the trial to hear the evidence. So this is new to them, even though they've built up the pictures of possibilities in their mind, even though they've gone through the gravest of losses by losing their daughter, still the absolute facts need to be brought forward during the trial. And they have to watch that man responsible for the murder of their child acting in a way that is absolutely unforgivable. So first of all, he's actually wearing a designer watch that Claire had bought him, and he was laughing at them from the dock. Genuinely, is it just me? And I don't think it is just me. I think I can trust it's just you guys as well. At the point where that man is laughing at the parents who have lost their child at his hands, is it not possible that, I don't know, the whole of the Scottish rugby team can just charge through the doors of the court, get on top of him in a scrum and just leave him there for several hours to see what happens? Just throwing it out there. I'm not saying there has to be a negative outcome for him. I'm just saying, let's just test it out and see how it goes as a theory. Let's just put it into practice and then we can have no questions about this. We'll know at the end of it, because honestly, that level of disrespect is repulsive. Absolutely repulsive beyond belief. So he is laughing at them. What does that tell you? Again, when you think about all the things I talked about earlier on regarding his lack of control about his behaviour, regarding his refusal to accept authority, seeing his repeat offending, this human being is not a safe human being to walk our streets. Ever. Simple as that. Ever. So the prosecution, they bring in the pathologist, and the pathologist testifies that Claire had at least 76 separate injuries, a huge amount. This is a 5'2" girl, remember. She's petite, and she's got 76 separate injuries. These included bleeding inside her skull, extensive neck injuries, 2 black eyes, and petechial hemorrhaging, which is a telltale sign of strangulation. There was a bone in her neck that had been fractured, so a great deal of force had been used there. And the post-mortem revealed that the cause of her actual death was a combination of head and neck injuries and subdural hemorrhage. McGowan also burned her with a lighter on her face, her nose and her thumb as she lay dying. So absolutely at that moment when she's in total crisis and agony, he just adds insult to injury, literal injury, by burning her in that way. Now, a taxi driver, a guy called David Addison, he'd picked the couple up earlier in that evening, and he said in court that he had literally overheard McGowan telling Claire, "I'll kill you." And also, he recalled him using a lot of really aggressive language. And The problem about being in a scenario where you're witnessing that is, ideally, you should speak to the police immediately. If you hear somebody who is threatening another human being and using that kind of language, it is worth offending and just getting in touch with the authorities, because if there is no case to answer, they won't have to answer the case. And the sad thing is that potentially, if that taxi driver had alerted the authorities, there may have been a different outcome. By the way, I'm not blaming David Addison. Obviously, he's a taxi driver, will see this kind of behaviour on multiple occasions and it doesn't lead to murder. But in my experience, when people are threatening in such a high level way, it's really important to make sure that there's a welfare check that takes place, because these things do happen. And in this case, it really did happen. And the paramedics who first responded to the scene at Claire's house, they testified that they found her, first of all, lying black and blue. She'd been that badly beaten that she was on a bedroom floor. She wasn't breathing. There was no heartbeat. And they noticed what appeared to be a baby white that was so deep in her throat that they literally could not get an airway tube in her without physically removing it. So he had basically tortured her. We're not talking about just a beating. We're talking about burning. We're talking about forcefully shoving things down her throat to block her airways. This is a protracted, aggressive, brutal killing. Now, the defence, honestly, I don't know whether people like this ever deserve a defence. I appreciate somebody has to do the job. It's a dirty job, and somebody definitely has to do it. And in this case, it was Paul Nelson, KC. He basically brought forward that, oh, feel sorry for him. Yeah, he went for the, my clients had a less than ideal upbringing. No shit, Sherlock. Well, loads of people don't have a good upbringing. It doesn't make them brutal killers of innocent, defenseless women, does it? But apparently that's the defense they're going through. So apparently McGowan had been physically abused by his mother. He was also the subject of social work involvement as a child. Well, you'd hope so, wouldn't you? If he was being physically abused by his mother, at the very least, you'd hope that there was some kind of social work involvement. I think that would be a good thing, wouldn't it? That would actually show a system working as opposed to failing. But that's the story that's being told. He couldn't help but horribly murder this young woman. He had a terrible childhood. It just goes without saying. Can you imagine if that was the rule? That people who had terrible childhoods, it was mitigated to a point where they didn't really have to pay for the consequences. There'd be a lot of dead bodies, wouldn't there? Everywhere. He also went on to talk about the dependency issues. He said that McGowan turned to using drink and drugs as a coping mechanism and that this led to his offending. No, it didn't. Sorry. It's ridiculous. You're saying that the reason that he's a violent person who's a predator around women, who incrementally controls and abuses them, who financially exploits them, this is down to the fact that he was treated badly as a kid and's got a problem with drugs and alcohol? Don't think so. In fact, very often people with drug and alcohol problems are very sensitive individuals with temperaments where they struggle to cope with life and they medicate themselves because of that using these substances. They're not going around being horrible human beings. Okay, they might not be the best selves because they've got a dependency issue, but they're not going out harming people. And it's actually pretty awful to suggest that this would be a leverage as to why somebody would act the way that this horrible predator is acting. Now, when this is being said by his own defence. So, McGowan, this is your defence lawyer. The job of a defence lawyer is to mitigate for you, minimise ideally the sentence that you're going to face, which for a very grave crime could be very long. So, what we're going to want you to do, McGowan, is when your defence attorney is speaking, shut up and look sad, right? That's the ideal scenario, isn't it? Because this is what the sob story is going to be about. But actually, what McGowan did, because he didn't get that memo or he just thought that he knew better, was as this is being put across to the court, he's heard saying, oh, for Christ's sake. I kid you not. This guy, shall we say, is a few sandwiches short of a picnic. But that's what he does. And I'm glad, because bear in mind, you have a very steely judge watching this play out. And believe me, those judges are quite quiet. But whilst they're quiet, they are seeping in exactly what is going on. And when somebody is acting in a way to mitigate your offences, and you're basically swearing in a court of law and being annoyed with it or seeming exasperated or frustrated, that judge is absolutely taking your number down. Simple as that. And McGowan's defence from the very get-go is problematic because initially he says that he's not guilty because she's fallen down the stairs, but then he changes that and says that she suffocated herself because that's a regular thing that happens, isn't it? I mean, if we're not hearing about all those women who are just haphazardly suffocating themselves on purpose, I don't know what papers I'm reading. Then another time he says, I have no idea. I've just no idea. All these injuries that she sustained, no idea. May I draw your attention to the fact that you knocked on the door of neighbours and said that you thought you'd killed her? I did do that, but what I'm saying is I didn't do that. But you definitely said that you did. You thought you'd killed her. You knocked on the neighbours' doors at 5 a.m. in the morning. I did do that, but that was only after she'd fell down the stairs, suffocated herself, and then I forgot everything and I don't even know what she did. I just know I didn't do it. Sorry, can the rugby team be brought in? Yeah. Oh, just the really big guys. In fact, if you can get all the nations in the UK, so England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, bring in all the biggest guys, and we'll just do that scrum right now in the court, anywhere in the court. The judge is going to referee. I kid you not. This is what he was doing. Understandably, for the jury, it's actually really helpful, isn't it? Because him chopping and changing his story demonstrates that he's a liar and also will embed the fact that they know that. Not that he ever stood a chance. Why he pled not guilty when initially he told people that he'd killed her. Secondly, the house was full of what was clearly a brutal attack and the remnants of it. And most importantly, her injuries could not have been self-inflicted and he was the only person near her, and he'd been witnessed being abusive to her by a taxi driver that evening and so on and so forth. There was no way he wasn't banged to rights. It's as simple as that. But these kind of predators, they believe that if they just tell a lie enough times, in the end, somebody's going to believe it. And let's be honest, the authorities had failed time and time again to bring him to a position where he understood consequences, so why not carry on the same? It only took the jury 2 hours, unsurprisingly, to come to a decision. I imagine 1.5 of those hours was deciding what sandwich they wanted to order before just going ahead and letting this not right know that he was absolutely 100% going to be brought to justice for this heinous murder of this poor young woman. And they unanimously convicted him of murder. After he'd been found guilty, Judge O'Grady made these remarks. The fact is, this young woman was not only murdered, she was subjected to nothing short of torture. I shudder to imagine what her last minutes were like. To describe what you did as sadistic falls woefully short of the mark. It was beyond sadistic. The consequences for Claire are self-evident. Her life is ended in pain and terror at the age of 28. But there are others who remain, who have also been robbed of the future they could have reasonably expected. Because if she was a young woman of 28, she was also a young daughter and a friend of 28, and perhaps cruelest of all, a young mother of 28. Those who gave her life, and who in turn she gave life, will now have the anguish of living without her and the dreadful pain of knowing how she died. I have in particular mind the victim impact statement of her young son, who now spends each day lonely, bereft and bewildered, unable to make sense of why he must grow up without his mother. Judge O'Grady also said this to McGowan: to those who have not listened to the evidence in this trial, it is difficult to convey the utter brutality of the death you inflicted on Claire Inglis. By the time her broken and lifeless body was found, she had no fewer than 76 separate sites of injury. There is no need for me to dwell on the detail. There are those present today who have already had too much to bear.
The fact is, this young woman was not only murdered, she was subjected by you to nothing short of torture. I shudder to imagine what her last minutes were like. To describe what you did as sadistic falls woefully short of the mark. It was beyond sadistic.
I think those comments are really powerful, and indeed often we hear about cases but we don't get to hear the details of those cases. But those who bear witness and have to listen to that information, it is often too much to bear. After he was found guilty, Scotland's Procurator Fiscal for Homicide, Moira Orr, she came out and said, this is a heartbreaking case of the murder of a young mother, Claire Inglis, by her abusive partner, Christopher McGowan. He showed cruelty and contempt for Claire and his actions have left her family devastated. We get to the sentencing. This happened on the 25th of October 2023, so really recent. I'm only in November 2023 now. Claire's family attended every single day of the trial, and they were really glad when he was found guilty. I have to say, in court, they made it very clear that day that they were just absolutely relieved that he had been found guilty. But then it comes down to how long he's going to serve, and they all broke down because he was given life. The judge made these comments regarding how McGowan had appeared during the court hearings too, because as I said, he wasn't being respectful, and they were watching that play out. We get to the sentencing of McGowan on the 25th of October 2023. Clearly, for Claire's family, this is D-Day. They want to know whether he is going to get a sentence that he absolutely deserves, because they have lost somebody of infinite meaning to their world. A little boy has lost his mother, and they want to see justice done. And Judge O'Grady, well, I think Judge O'Grady is a pretty good judge of character as well as law. He said, "I have to take into account your attitude towards the appalling crime you have committed. The background report, which I have before me, remarkably suggests that you accept full responsibility and that during interview you showed remorse and regret. Let me deal with that. It is clear that you accept no responsibility. Indeed, in interview, you have gone to great lengths to minimise and deny your responsibility for Claire's death. And as for your remorse and regret, I have watched you carefully throughout these proceedings. Even in the face of the most graphic and distressing evidence, you've shown not a flicker of emotion, not a hint of distress, not a shadow of remorse. Indeed, in the course of interview, you provided the author of the report with a lengthy and detailed account of events that night, which account the evidence has shown is a self-serving tissue of lies and a grotesque distortion of the awful truth of what you did. It is that dishonesty which is the true measure of your remorse. As for the tears you shed at interview, I have no doubt they were shed for none but yourself." Passing sentence. That same judge, Judge O'Grady, warned McGowan there was no guarantee he was going to be released at the end of the 23-year term that he imposed. When he gave the sentence of 23 years, Claire's family apparently wept with relief, and there were shouts of elation in the court that this horrific excuse for a human would be incarcerated for a long period of time. And the judge added this: "As you know, the jury having convicted you of the crime of murder by law, there is only one sentence I can impose, and that is one of life imprisonment. The nature of that sentence is much misunderstood, and so it is perhaps appropriate for me at this stage to make it clear its mechanics and consequences so that you and others with an interest fully understand them. The role of the judge in imposing a sentence of life imprisonment is limited by law to fixing what is known as the punishment part of the sentence. The punishment part which I will fix today is not to be taken as the length of the sentence which you will serve before release. It is no more than the fixing of the minimum period you will serve before you can apply for parole. It should be understood that it is not necessarily the period you will actually serve before being granted parole. It is commonplace for life prisoners to serve a significantly longer period than the punishment part before being granted parole. The issue of when, if ever, you are released is not a matter for this court. It is a matter for the parole board to assess in due course whether it is safe and in the public interest that you be released at all." Let me emphasize those words, if ever. I mean, that judge really is making a stand there, isn't it? They're obviously letting him know you're probably never going to be free. And I have to say, when you think about what he did to Claire and all his prior, I think that Judge O'Grady is 100% correct. Now, there have been criticisms of how Claire ended up in a situation where McGowan was actually living with her. So one of the main questions from her parents is, why was he granted bail? And why was he granted bail and allowed to go to Claire's? Now, in September 2021, he pled guilty to charges of dangerous driving, resisting arrest and breaching a bail curfew. Now, when someone is bailed, they have to go ahead and provide an address where they'll stay until that case is concluded. And often there are special conditions like a bail curfew. That's what happened to McGowan. He wasn't meant to be out between certain periods of time. Now, in accordance with normal procedure, following a guilty plea, the Crown wouldn't tend to oppose bail unless it's received some specific intelligence. So, say somebody's at risk. And McGowan's most recent record were breaches of the peace and breaches of bail. Now, if you look back at his record, one of the breaches of the peace, which was from 2014, that did have domestic aggravation, but it didn't involve Claire. Now, a legal specialist, Ian Waugh, who's a partner at the law firm Waugh & Sweeney, he deals with bail on a daily basis. And he said that the Sheriff's Department, when it comes to these issues, they've got a balancing act to carry out. So the older the offence is that's on record, the less significance of weight the Sheriff will attach to that. But essentially that puts Claire at danger, because if they're not taken seriously, something that could demonstrate a potentially violent perpetrator who is domestically abusive towards women, then arguably that's going to mean that the person who could protect themselves by avoiding that human being and not being in a relationship with them because of those past offences won't be informed. And they knowingly and willingly let McGowan go and live at Claire's, even though he was clearly a threat. And Scottish Women's Aid CEO Marsha Scott actually believes that the system entirely failed Claire. And the week that Claire was murdered, Scotland's top politicians gathered at Holyrood for a minute's silence to just remember the women and girls who've been killed at the hands of men. Minute's silence not going to do anything, is it? Sorry, it's not. Protocol changes might. You know, that classic lessons learned, that might as well. It drives me mad when they do things like this. I know it's a respectful thing, but with respect, just change things, change the system, inform people when they might be living with a potential predator. That might help. And Marsha Scott, the CEO of Women's Aid, also said any system that considers itself competent around domestic abuse should have had their red flags going off. It should have thought before bailing him to that address. The answer isn't to take the most vulnerable people in society and make them more vulnerable. Amen. That is so correct. 24 hours after McGowan was jailed, Claire's parents, Fiona and Ian, joined Scottish Conservative MP Russell Findlay, who's the Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Justice in Parliament, to ask some very serious questions. Findlay asked the leader of the SNP, Humza Yousaf, why was a violent criminal with dozens of convictions granted bail 5 times? And why, since her murder, has the SNP passed a law that makes it even harder to remand criminals in custody? So he asked for an independent inquiry because it's topsy-turvy and a crazy world where things get easier for these mistakes to happen rather than harder. But the leader of the SNP said he couldn't do that. He couldn't ask for the independent inquiry. He said that decisions about cases of bail and remand are for the independent judiciary rather than the government. So let's just pass the buck. Let's just decide that it's not my job. I'm just the leader of the party who's meant to be in charge of Scotland. So what power have I got? I'm just the leader of Scotland. I think that you'd have quite a lot of power being the leader of Scotland. Well, you'd think so, but I haven't. Can't tread on the toes of the judiciary. Why don't you? Why don't you get some size 14s and tread away? It might save some lives. We're talking about the murder of women. What is going on that you can't annoy some people by getting involved and invading the space of those who believe that only they should inhabit such realms? This isn't Hogwarts. We're not talking about a magical kingdom where your self combust if you happen to knock on the wrong door. I don't think that happened at Hogwarts, with respect. It's a whole new trilogy that I can create. But this is what goes wrong. This is why lessons never get learned. He was basically saying he couldn't tread on other people's toes, so he goes ahead and says that instead he'll convey the family's concerns to Scotland's most senior judge and the Lord Advocate, who heads the Crown Office. Oh well, that's going to be massively impactful, isn't it? The end of the day. I don't know about you, but when I think about things that need to change to save the lives of innocent women, I often think that a strongly worded email or conveying the upset about a certain thing will make a massive difference. If I'm not changing my behaviour because somebody is conveying that they're a little bit upset with me, I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, that's the way the world works, isn't it? Massively serious issue. All you need to do is convey the family's concerns to the individuals that you want change around, and it will happen. Always. Absolutely. Every day of the week. The fact that the leader of the SNP has refused to do an independent inquiry because you know it's somebody else's job, that's why women will continue to die. It's as simple as that. Treading on people's toes should be something you're entirely willing to do if it is going to protect people. And when you consider this case, it is clear that massive failures occurred. When you think about the perpetrator's past offending, he was a danger, pure and simple. And since Claire's death, ex-girlfriends have spoken out about him. So Charlie Sharp, she said that she genuinely thinks that she would have ended up dead at the hands of Christopher McGowan if her mum hadn't actually urged her to flee after watching a documentary called Murdered by My Boyfriend. Charlie, who has actually 2 children to him, so we have to remember as well they're victims too. McGowan has children and they have to grow up knowing what their father has done. And Charlie, who herself was a victim, said she couldn't believe that he'd actually taken somebody's life, that she'd heard about the details of what he did, that she felt numb because it could have been her. And she genuinely sat and asked herself, what would have happened if I'd stayed? My kids would have been left without a mother. She said that during the course of the relationship, he pushed her, he choked her, he hit her, he spat in her face. She said he was abusive to her even when she was pregnant. He controlled who she saw, where she went. Once he held a machete to his own neck and then to her neck. And she said that she remembered that before she actually left him in 2017, her mum had suggested that she watched a TV programme called Killed by My Boyfriend. And her mother said, if you don't leave him, this is going to be you. He's going to kill you. 10 years later, he murdered Claire. So her mother's intuition was 100% correct. And Charlie's right. It could well have been her if she'd stayed. Charlie also said that in 2019, so very recently, he'd been granted bail to her address during a court appearance. And he'd said that he'd changed, but it was a complete act, she said. And he got really violent with her. She said he would just switch at any moment. So he's got this history of domestic violence and abuse. And she can't quite believe, with that in mind, that he was ever granted bail and released to Claire's house to live with her, but more than that, to live with her young son. So when he was bailed to Charles in 2019, the only reason he was given that opportunity essentially was he told the court that they were going to make it work as a family. But she said it was just always an act. He acts like he's towing the line. He acts like he's going to change. And then he's a complete, quote, psycho. In fact, she said his name should have been Christopher Bale McGowan, because that's how regular it was happening. So he was given, as far as she was concerned, chance after chance after chance. And in the end, that chance led to him being able to kill Claire. She said that there isn't a day where Claire isn't actually in her thoughts, and that her heart goes out fully to her son and to her parents. And bear in mind that Charlie was 14 when she met McGowan, and they were together for around 6 years. In fact, she was the person that he abused in 2014. That should have been the trigger to prevent him being bailed to Claire's address. During that incident, McGowan was convicted of domestic aggravation against Charlie. Now, she did split up in 2017, but like I said, in 2019, he came back into her life, ended up getting into a jealous rage, kicked her in the head, left her concussed. It is harrowing to know that this person was simply a repeat offender from a very early age. As Charlie said, he was nice at first, but then he just became really controlling, really jealous. He isolated her from her friends, even her mum. He wouldn't let her wear makeup or shorts. Even after they split up in 2019, he accused her of going with his cousin, attacked her because of that. And while she called the police to let them know, they told her there was no evidence and they couldn't do anything. Not my problem, sorry, can't help. She described him as having a really split personality, that he could turn on her at any time. He was a horrible person, as she puts it, a complete monster. But she also said he was a master manipulator. He'd apologise, he'd beg you to come back, he'd promise he'd change, he'd bring you flowers, tell you he loved you, then it would happen again. And she said that in the end, she got to such a point of helplessness that even though she knew he could possibly kill her, she just got on with life with him. Just didn't allow herself to think about it. She was that helpless in that situation. Unfortunately for her, she had a baby daughter, came home from the hospital and realised that now she had a newborn, it was time for change. And fortunately, that's when she left. But unfortunately, that left the door open for Claire to meet him. And when she started dating McGowan, it turned out that Charlie and Claire's children were actually best friends at the same nursery. So Charlie knew Claire. And Claire actually used to go out with one of Christopher's cousins. So Charlie had known her previously. And she said that Claire was a lovely human being. She bought her kids presents when they were born, that was the kind of person that she was. She said that they'd speak to one another, that they'd talk about the kids because they were best friends, and that Claire's son would always be noted as her son's best friend. He would tell Charlie about that. And when Claire started to date McGowan, one of the difficult things for Charlie, his ex, was that she would see McGowan actually walking Claire's son to school, carving pumpkins with him, doing things that her own children didn't get the opportunity to do. So he wasn't a dad to his own kids, and that hurt Charlie. She felt like maybe her kids weren't enough for him. But of course, what we know is in coercive controlled relationships, that's what love bombing is about. You make yourself seem like the best human being in the world. So he was playing a role. He was pretending he was a good father for Claire, but actually deserting and abandoning his own children. So this man was a deceiver of the highest level. And what's really upsetting is that Charlie even said that when she saw that Claire was involved with Christopher McGowan, it kind of made her feel that her kids would benefit because Claire would be in their life. And she was such a good mum to her own little boy, a mum who was prevented from carrying on down that trajectory because her life was stolen by this horrible human being. And Charlie went on to say, because we have to remember she's a victim in this too, she's got 2 children with this man. She said, after the trial, I had to sit down with my son and explain to him what his dad did. I had to tell him that he killed his friend's mum. She said it was incredibly hard. My son now goes to school and kids can be so cruel, but I wanted him to hear the truth about his dad from me. Now, there is a legacy as far as Claire's death is concerned. So the local community rallied around their donations, helped to fund a bench in her memory. And the plaque on that bench says, "We will look for you in rainbows." Fiona, Claire's mum, misses so many things about her daughter. She says just picking up the phone, knowing that she was the end of the phone, she was my best pal. She was a brilliant wee daughter. Claire's 9-year-old son as well was made an orphan due to McGowan's actions because, as I told you earlier on, his father died in an accident a few years earlier. So he's now, fortunately, being taken care of by his absolutely devoted and loving grandparents. Claire was one of 9 women in Scotland killed by their partner or former partner in 2021. In each of those cases, the killer was male. In memory of Claire, her mother Fiona decided that, as regards the funeral, she was going to bring forth the personality of her much-loved child. She said that she used to be a right wee entertainer. They have her on videos. She was singing, she was dancing. Her mum said she was a right girly girl. So she said that's why I had her coffin pink. She thought, Claire can't go away in an oak coffin. It's got to be pink. So I had it a baby pink colour. Her parents are also trying to provide a life for her son that has sadly been denied for Claire. Her mum said in a recent interview that life is never boring. He's a character. Obviously, I'm his nana, but I love the bones of him. Always have, because we've been there from day dot. He's such a good wee bairn. He's got a heart of gold, like his mum. And that is how we should all choose to remember Claire. I hope I've done this case justice. It was one that really spoke to me when I heard about it. Obviously, in my mind is the fact that there is a little boy who's been left without his mummy, a devoted mummy, somebody who was absolutely loved and adored by her family. It came from a really supportive background and to all intents and purposes should be thriving as a mum, falling in love with a decent human being, living a future that she so deserved, and that's been stolen. I hope you feel as frustrated as I do that the system has yet again failed to such a degree that when you look at the chain of causation, there is a possibility it could have been deflected and we would not be talking about Claire's murder today. I hope that if you've heard about this case, you feel I've done it the justice it deserves, because it does deserve this justice. And I'm so glad the judge in this case presided so carefully over the outcome. I'm so glad the diligence was paid by this individual and that he really did get, as a predator, as a perpetrator, as a murderer, his just desserts. And as the judge said, there's a very strong possibility that Christopher McGowan will never walk our streets as a free man again. Let me know your thoughts on this, guys. And remember, if you recognise yourself in any of the things I've said today, if you have a partner who is making you feel that you have to reason with unreasonable, if they're financially controlling you, if they're isolating you from your family, if they're promising you the world and giving you scraps, if they're calling you names and making you feel less than, if they are consistently changing the rules to make you feel confused and distressed, if they're preventing you from going out the places that you wish to go out, getting involved in the hobbies that you used to take part in, dressing in a certain way, and so on and so forth, listen. The reality is that's what coercive controllers do, and they will not be satisfied until they fully control you, your life, your future, and at times, the end of your world. If Christopher McGowan can teach you one thing, if Claire can have a legacy, then it's to protect others from ending up in a similar circumstance and situation. People do not deserve to end up in relationships like this. If anything sparks your conscience and you relate to it, get out. Take care, guys. Be safe.